In the spring of 1944, the German troops stationed in northern France began receiving warnings about enemy movements across the Channel. The orders were precise: guard the defences of the Atlantic Wall. Trenches were inspected, key points were reinforced, cannons were positioned and traps were installed. The commanders knew an attack was coming, but no one said when or where. At dawn on the 6th of June, the assault began. The bombardment from the sea and the sky was constant. Communication lines were broken. The units that needed to move did not receive permission in time. The groups were left alone. The German soldiers held on without reinforcements, under continuous fire without help from the air. The defences fell one after another. Some groups fought until they ran out of bullets. Others were surrounded. In a few days, the entire front began to collapse. Those who managed to escape faced retreat, relentless attacks, encirclement, entrapment, or death. What happened within the German lines as D-Day swept across the French coast? Night guards on the coast of the Somme. In the small hamlet of Molière-d'Aval, south of the Somme estuary, soldier Heinrich Böll wrote to his wife almost every day. His only distraction was writing and waiting for a reply. They would get up around noon, eat, exercise, reinforce the trenches, and from 10 at night they took 4-hour shifts to watch the sea. Böll had already spent 3 years rotating through posts in France, first in Cap Gris-Nez and now in this estuary. The routine was repetitive. The constant waiting wore them down. If at least once we saw the English face to face, it would be something different from this eternal endurance, he wrote in August of 1943. If they tried to attack here and failed, maybe that would turn the war. With what we have in this area, they probably won't even try. But no one knows what's coming. For almost 4 years, soldiers like him had lived peacefully in France, far from the Eastern Front, the African desert, or the Italian mountains. But in the spring of 1944, they knew that was about to end. The signs were all along the coast. In less than half a year, 500,000 obstacles had been installed, made of wood or metal, more than 6 million explosives. On the cliffs, machine gun nests were connected by trenches and hundreds of kilometers of wire. Behind them, concrete bunkers with heavy cannons and more machine guns. Then came a strip planted with traps, flooded lowlands, barriers against tanks, minefields, stakes with old shells. All of this was meant to stop any aerial or land landing. Beyond the coastal edge, preparations were also visible. Train stations, railway crossings, bridges, arsenals, depots, artillery positions, radars. At the beginning of 44, the German army's support network in France had begun to be attacked by enemy planes. The raids reached up to 750 aircraft at a time. The fighter bombers roamed northern France unhindered, shooting at trains, trucks, depots. By the time June arrived, more than 76,000 tons of bombs had already been dropped, almost completely cutting access to the rest of the Reich. What could not be seen could still be felt. The soldiers' instincts sensed it. Near Bayeux, Artillery Chief Werner Pluskat gathered his unit. The usual message turned different, more curt. Gunnar Heinz-Severloh noticed it. Pluskat talked about fulfilling our duty as always, but in the end, he said something he had never said before: a dead German can no longer save his homeland. To the west, near Colleville, Franz Gockel, 18 years old, looked out over the channel. His post was a concrete shelter almost 2 meters thick. We rarely saw 2 German planes flying over the area. We nicknamed them Max and Moritz, he said. The defences were being reinforced. Cannons were being installed, both real and fake. The alert level was rising. The more veteran soldiers sensed it. "Something is coming," they murmured. In the warm days of the summer of 40, the idea of an invasion was non-existent. The German army had taken positions to maintain control. 100 divisions, 10 of them armoured, dominated the west. It seemed nothing could stop them. "With this victory, the army's task here is completed," said the commanders. But later, the conflicts in the Balkans, Africa and Russia began to drain resources. In June of 1941, when the offensive against the Soviet Union began, only 37 second-line divisions remained in the west. The following year, just 24 divisions without tanks guarded the entire coast from the Netherlands to the Spanish border. General Gerd von Rundstedt, supreme commander of the Western Front, not only had few troops, but those that remained were of poor quality, worn-out units or new ones without experience. Rundstedt arrived in France in March of 1942. He was 66 years old, had been a soldier for over half a century, and had previously been dismissed for ordering a retreat on the Eastern Front. He never identified with the party, but he was also not known to oppose the regime. That made him useful. When offered command, he replied, "Whatever the Führer orders, I will do until my last breath." His base was beneath a hill, behind a school in the suburbs of Paris. He lived in a confiscated house. He adapted well to the pace of command in France. He did not work past 8 at night, woke up late, liked cigars and alcohol, but did not live luxuriously. His aides respected him. They nicknamed him the Last Gentleman. His memory and strategic vision remained sharp. His mere presence lifted the troops' spirits. Even so, his position had little real power. Hitler and his direct circle made all decisions. The Navy and Air Force were not under his control. "Do you see the guard outside?" he complained. "If I want to move him to the other side, I have to ask for permission in Berchtesgaden." Meanwhile, the soldiers in France lived relaxed. There were shows, theatre tickets, rest homes with a vacation atmosphere, recalled a sailor in Cherbourg. Those on the Eastern Front called them those who live like gods in France. But it was not quite like that. Going to Paris was restricted. They didn't want to disturb the locals or lose control. An infantryman complained, "We didn't even get to know the country's culture." Minister Goebbels noted it. "Living in France has never done our troops any good." Over time, the routine, the alcohol, the French women, and the lack of discipline caused problems. Cases of abuse, theft, and violence increased. The duties were boring. "The one patrolling the cliffs sees nothing but waves coming and going," said Captain Lindner. Bull summed it up. "Each night we wait for the English, but they still don't appear. I'm curious to know if they will really come." They tried once. It was in Dieppe on the 19th of August, 1942. The Allied tanks barely made it out of the water and became trapped. They failed to break through. By the afternoon, it was all over. A German officer saw them retreating through smoke. "In our area, thousands of prisoners arrived, all Canadians, young, strapping," he noted. Among the wreckage, piles of dead and wounded. On one landing craft, the 40 crew members had been blown up with a single hit. Debris floated, corpses, people struggling to survive. In Paris, there was celebration. The enemy operation was crushed in a little over 9 hours, the German command boasted. That same night, Hitler received the report. There is no longer a single-armed Englishman on the continent. They had lost 33 barges, 106 aircraft, 28 tanks, a destroyer. Of 5,000 Canadians, only 2,200 returned. On the German side, there were about 600 wounded or dead. Chief of Staff Kurt Zeitzler arrived the next day and saw corpses everywhere. "Dieppe looks like Dunkirk," he summed up. Even before that attack, Hitler had already been thinking about building a concrete wall on the coast. He called it the Atlantic Wall. He wanted an impenetrable barrier that would also motivate his troops. In August of 42, he explained the plan. A second Allied offensive must be prevented at all costs. A wall will be built to block any entry. That wall would have 15,000 bunkers, 10,000 of them in France alone. "The most valuable thing is the lives of Germans. It's better to spend on concrete than on blood," he said. But building something like that took time. The Führer's deadline, May of 43, was impossible. The Todt organization, responsible for construction, estimated that at best they could build 6,000 positions. On the western wall, one worker was assigned per meter. On this new wall, just one every 7. Even so, they began building. 5,000 structures already existed. By mid-43, there were more than 8,000. Around 250,000 workers were involved. Fortified points were raised with cannons, machine guns, trenches, barbed wire, tank traps. The press sold it as the strongest wall in history. "A shield of steel and cement that protects Europe's values," they said. Von Rundstedt had another opinion. Pure facade. To him, that wall would hold out for 1 day at most. Hitler believed it would last an entire month. Rommel against everyone, the plan no one wanted to follow. Rommel began the year by turning his ideas into orders. His tour of the Pas-de-Calais convinced him that the enemy had to be stopped right where they landed. "The most difficult moment for them is when they touch ground. They must be stopped right there," he insisted. That's why the beaches had to become traps. Stakes with mines were planted, steel and concrete structures were submerged to break landing craft, and explosives were prepared along the roads. But for Rommel, that wasn't enough. The Marshal proposed that the entire coastal strip, 5 to 6 kilometers inland, be turned into a continuous line of obstacles: minefields, machine gun positions, anti-tank weapons, mortars, heavy artillery. According to his assessment, at that moment the enemy would win. But if given a few more months, he could stop them. "If we have time, we will manage to stop them," he wrote. The most urgent problem was control of the sky. The German Air Force barely existed in France. Its chief, Marshal Hugo Sperel, had his base in a castle on the outskirts of Paris. For 4 years he had lived surrounded by luxury. Hitler complained, "He only thinks about lunch." Rommel's naval advisor admitted that Sperel understood the situation well, but offered no solutions. For Rommel, what he saw was disappointing. The Luftwaffe's plan was to scatter before the Allied attack. They would move to improvised airstrips throughout France, Belgium and Western Germany. Fake airfields would be created, and when the invasion began, they would all return to the area. Goering put it this way: "Not a single plane will remain in Germany, all will go to the front." While that was being planned, the atmosphere among the German High Command was confrontational. Rommel had no direct authority over many of the divisions, and his vision clashed with that of other leaders. For him, the troops had to be right on the coast. For the High Command, the forces should stay further back, ready to counter-attack. Rundstedt supported this latter idea. He said that if everything was placed at the water's edge, the enemy would wipe it all out with naval artillery. Rommel thought the opposite. He believed that if the enemy managed to settle in, it would be impossible to dislodge them. He wanted to stop them from the first minute. General Geyer von Schweppenburg, in command of the tank group, also disagreed with him. And there was another factor: Hitler. Only he had the final word to move the armored units. No one else could authorize them. In practice, the tanks could not be used without his direct permission. That nullified any quick initiative. In April, Hitler summoned all the commanders to Berchtesgaden. Rommel defended his idea of defending the beach. Rundstedt and Geyer insisted on the need to keep mobile reserves out of range of naval bombardment. Hitler, as always, listened and decided nothing. In the end, he ordered the tanks to be divided, half with Rommel, the other with the High Command, and he would continue to have final control over all of them. That distribution left everyone unsatisfied. No one could act quickly. The system was slow, bureaucratic, centralized. Rommel was frustrated. The order was clear. In case of invasion, they had to wait for Hitler to approve the use of each tank. Thus, every lost minute would work against them. On the 5th of June, Rommel traveled home for his wife's birthday. He planned to return on the 7th, but he would no longer make it in time. Meanwhile, the weather in Normandy was grey. It was raining. No one believed the Allies would land in that storm. That's why many commanders were not at their posts. At headquarters, the phones began to ring just after midnight on the 6th of June. Units were reporting enemy paratroopers in various locations. The reports were confusing. There was talk of fake maneuvers. It was believed to be a diversion. But in the early hours of the morning, reality became clear. Off the coast, thousands of enemy ships lined up. The naval bombardment began. The German defenses were shaken without pause. The noise was deafening. Communication lines were broken. No one knew exactly what was happening in each sector. The first orders from High Command took hours. The tanks stationed far from the beach did not move. No one dared act without the Führer's approval. By the time permission was granted for them to advance, it was already too late. The Allied forces had taken the beaches. At the center of German command, confusion reigned. Rundstedt requested authorization to deploy all tanks. He was told to wait. The same happened with other units. Time was lost. Meanwhile, the soldiers on the front defended themselves as best they could, without reinforcements, without air support, only with what they had on hand. Rommel learned of the attack while still at home. He returned immediately. He arrived at headquarters by evening. It was already too late. The enemy had succeeded in landing. The coastal line had been breached. Over the following days, Rommel tried to reorganize the defense. He toured the battered zones. He spoke with officers. He tried to lift morale, but the damage was already done. The Allied forces had established a firm foothold. They had brought thousands of men, vehicles, weapons. The Luftwaffe remained absent. There were no planes to counterattack. The German Navy did not intervene either. The frontline soldiers were alone. The reports coming in were desperate. Many units had been destroyed, others were trapped. The enemy advanced little by little, but without stopping. Rommel understood that without control of the skies or constant reinforcements, the battle was lost. But no one listened to him. They were still waiting for orders from Berlin. The chain of command grew slower each day. Meanwhile, the Allies continued to bring in more troops. The Marshal requested a tactical withdrawal. He proposed abandoning unsustainable zones. But Hitler rejected it. He said they had to resist every meter, that no ground should be given up, that any retreat was a betrayal, that rigidity doomed many units to destruction. Rommel watched as the front collapsed. He tried to convince his superiors. He showed data, maps, reports, but no one reacted. Command remained fixated on the idea of a counter-offensive. They still talked about pushing the enemy back into the sea, but the facts showed something else. Every day the casualties increased. The German lines shrank. Resources were running out. The troops were at their limit. Rommel knew that the battle for France had been lost in the first days of June, due to a lack of speed, for not giving his commanders freedom of action, for maintaining a slow, rigid and centralized decision-making system. Thus, Rommel's plan was buried under distrust, delays, and the fear of acting without permission. He had designed a defense based on speed and anticipation, but High Command chose to wait. By the time they tried to react, it was already too late. Trapped in concrete, the immobile panzer's trap. Gustav Winter had started the war in a tank unit. He ended his service stuck in a motionless turret, encased in concrete, on the coast of Normandy. He belonged to the 726th Regiment of the 716th Static Division. His post was on a dune, just behind Colville Beach in front of Omaha. The vehicle he occupied could no longer move. It was an old Panzer III without engine or wheels, embedded in a concrete box up to the edge. It only served as a firing point. The terrain was sandy, so they couldn't bury it directly. Everything was surrounded by concrete. Only 2 people remained inside, the gunner and the loader. The cannon was operated with a crank. They nicknamed it the concrete tank. From there, the cannon pointed to the edge of the beach. Its task was to fire at anyone attempting to leave the water. Its position was part of the main defense, right behind the machine guns and cannons that covered the shoreline. He had previously served in France and Russia in a complete Panzer III. Now his only function was to fire from a fixed box. The change was hard for him to accept. He had lost 2 fingers to frostbite on the Russian front. He couldn't feel part of his nose. His feet were damaged. Spending more than a day in a tank without heating, in sub-zero temperatures, had left its mark. On one occasion, an entire crew froze to death. When they were pulled out, they looked like statues. Because of that, he was reassigned as an instructor, but then he was reassigned again. They feared his appearance would scare the recruits. They put him to drive trucks. Later, as he was an expert gunner, he was sent to the Atlantic Wall. The firing system was adapted so he could use it with 8 fingers. His assistant was a young Czech German, a bit slow but enthusiastic. His post was part of a network of positions in the dunes. There was a rotating anti-tank gun, several 1- or 2-man shelters, trenches for infantry, and some houses turned into barracks, connected by tunnels and filled with traps. To him, those defences were weak, at least compared to what he had seen in the east. But there, in France, they believed the Allies couldn't land with enough tanks. They knew they had landing craft, but not in quantities capable of moving thousands of vehicles at once. They didn't imagine the enemy's organizational capacity. The beaches were strewn with metal structures with mines called Belgian gates, designed to blow up tracks and damage landing craft. Thousands of these obstacles covered the strip between high and low tide. Everything seemed very secure. Even so, some soldiers suffered from what they called invasion fear. They spent their days staring at the sea with binoculars, waiting for something to appear. They lived isolated in the dunes. Anxiety grew with every rumor. In practical terms, life was comfortable. French civilians would come to trade despite the rules. They brought bread, milk, cider, eggs, and even meat. In exchange, they received cigarettes, shoelaces, or lamp oil. They also hunted seagulls and rabbits. Their shelters were full of food and drink. Officers would inspect and take a share. In armoured divisions, this was not allowed, but in static infantry units it was common. The contact with the French was cordial. Many complained about the Allied bombings. Some hated de Gaulle, calling him a traitor. Many furiously insulted the English. Others simply lived detached from the war. They said French peasants knew as much about the world as those in any other country. Winter, who came from Berlin, considered himself well informed. Some soldiers had children with local women. When that happened, the women were sent to a house in the rear, run by nuns, where the children were born. The place was known as the House of the Children. There were many German-French babies there. The same had happened during the previous war. A story circulated among them. A comrade who supposedly had a child in that house found out that the place had been hit by an Allied bomb. Several children died. Since then, that soldier became obsessed with killing enemies. He said the Americans were to blame. No one ever knew if the story was true. Winter also felt resentment. Several of his relatives had died in bombings in Berlin, and many of his comrades shared that anger. They felt the Western Allies were distracting them from the real fight, the one in the East. That idea is no longer accepted today, but at the time, many saw it as a betrayal. They believed that instead of attacking France, the Allies should have supported Germany against the Soviets. In the early morning of the 6th of June, Winter and his assistant entered the concrete tank at midnight. They took over the shift. Planes could be heard, but nothing was visible. They assumed it was another routine bombing. The turret was spacious, without an engine, empty inside. It had a 50mm cannon and a telescopic sight. It also had mounted binoculars for watching the sea. There was moonlight. Visibility was low, but that was not unusual. Almost never had they seen any movement. In all that time, they had hardly seen ships, nor planes. The German Navy had no large vessels in that sector. They were used to the emptiness. Around 5 in the morning, their officer passed by on horseback. He was a veteran of the previous war and was proud of his Austrian horse. He warned them that there was strange activity with gliders farther east. He asked them to stay fully alert. They saw flares in the sky, then planes crossing through the clouds. They had no nearby air defense except for a single small anti-aircraft gun in the rear. Winter began to feel exposed. The wind carried a sense of foreboding. At 5:15, the light grew stronger. No ships were visible yet, just flashes on the horizon. He thought they were more flares. Then came the first impacts, massive explosions. The tank's walls vibrated. It was naval fire, something they had never experienced there. The ship cannons were firing non-stop. Each impact felt like a blow to the stomach. The Czech boy dropped to the floor, crying. He was only 17. He had never been in combat. Winter shouted at him to get up, but the boy didn't respond. The bombs kept falling. Pieces of metal struck the turret. Smoke seeped in through the cracks. Then the bombardment seemed to shift inland. Winter cracked the hatch open. The landscape was a disaster. A bunker had been destroyed. There were craters everywhere. The sand was burning. The anti-tank gun was still standing. Its operator raised a green flag, the signal that it was still operational. That was the soldier who had lost his child. With daylight, he saw what was coming from the sea. An endless line of ships. It looked like a wall of steel. Also, hundreds of planes flew overhead. He couldn't hear them because he was dazed, but he could feel the air vibrating. It was as if the entire sky was trembling. The fighters descended. They strafed his position. The bullets damaged the turret. If they came back, they would destroy them. But they flew off to the south. Smoke covered everything. He could barely see. His companion remained on the ground. When the air cleared a little, he looked again. Now he could see the transports approaching. They were slow. Some exploded when hitting mines. One landing craft blew apart. Another lost its ramp, and the soldiers fell into the water. Some boats caught fire. There were bodies floating, and they hadn't even touched land yet. The bombardment returned, this time closer. Nothing could be seen anymore. Only smoke, noise, fire. They remained trapped inside the tank, not knowing whether they were winning or losing. Hours passed. The enemy was already on the beach, but from their position, they could do nothing but wait. Winter knew that the troops on the front line were mostly Russians who had switched sides. He felt sorry for them. They were as trapped as he was. Inland beach, close quarters combat. As the naval fire struck the coastal defences, the Allied barges approached slowly. Many were hit by explosives buried in the sand. Others were struck from German positions. Some exploded before reaching shore. The water began to fill with debris, bodies, smoke, and burning metal. At a point near Vierville, Corporal Franz Mahler, from his observation post, described that he had never seen so many ships together. He said it was impossible to count them. He could only make out a continuous line of vessels at sea, firing non-stop toward the coast. He was in a reinforced house used as a lookout post. It was surrounded by mines, wire, and other traps. From the rooftop, he could follow the movement of the ships, although most of the time the smoke covered everything. In his diary, he wrote that the first thought that came to him was that he was going to die that morning. Nearby, at a German military police post, Sergeant Oskar Kellner recounted that upon hearing the first shelling, his unit ran for the shelters. They didn't know whether it was planes or ships. They only heard very loud explosions and the whizzing of projectiles flying overhead. Several men were wounded by shock waves without direct contact with the blasts. His section was tasked with guarding road crossings and controlling access points. But the chaos overwhelmed them. They had no information. No one was informing them of anything. Communications had been cut. The officers kept repeating that they had to wait for orders. Meanwhile, the sky was full of planes, the sea full of vessels, and the ground was shaking. North of Colleville, in a ditch near the beach, soldier Karl Horst Dreher was entrenched with his platoon. At 6 in the morning, they began to see human figures emerging from the sea. At first, they noticed only blurry shadows. Then they made out helmets and backpacks. The machine gun bursts began. Dreher fired without stopping. He said the weapons recoil and the noise made him forget everything else. The Allies kept arriving. Despite the initial casualties, they continued advancing across the sand. They took cover among the obstacles. Others fell before reaching the shore. Some crawled through the water with wet gear and torn clothing. From the German positions, everything seemed to move slowly, like an endless mass of soldiers. Dreher said that the smoke and noise made it impossible to know if they were surrounded. They felt like they were firing blindly. Sometimes their bullets hit the water, other times they saw someone fall. They didn't know whether it was the result of their shots or a nearby explosion. Further east, in a house occupied by German infantry, Corporal Wilhelm Trost and his group were defending an intersection that led to the beach. They had reinforced windows with rifle slits. When the first Allied soldiers ran past the house, the close-range shooting began. Trost recounted that he could see their faces. Some were shouting, others shooting without aiming. Several were wounded and fell to the ground. From inside, the Germans fired every time they saw a figure move. One of his comrades, without leaving his post, emptied 5 magazines. He never knew if he had hit anyone. One of the Allied paratroopers got trapped between the house and a hedge. He tried to throw a grenade but was hit before he could. Another tried to take cover behind a post, but a burst of gunfire brought him down. Trost wrote that he had never seen anything so chaotic. The air was filled with dust, smoke, screams, and gunfire. At the end of the road, an anti-tank gun kept firing at the vehicles approaching from the beach, but the explosions silenced it minutes later. The remains of the gun were left smoking. There were no signs of the gunners. At another location, a light artillery platoon was trying to move a 75mm cannon to a better position. They were pushing it with several men when a projectile fell nearby. The blast wave threw them to the ground. 2 did not get back up. The rest retreated without the cannon. Further back along the internal roads, reinforcements tried to advance, but Allied aviation blocked every attempt. Every column that emerged into the open was bombarded. Some vehicles were engulfed in flames without even reaching the front. The survivors scattered across the fields, not knowing where to go. An officer from the 316th Battalion wrote that everything they had practiced in training was useless in that situation, that no order remained valid for more than 10 minutes, that each section fought alone without knowing what the others were doing, that the only thing they could do was resist until they ran out of ammunition. German snipers moved among the remains of houses, looking for elevated positions. From there, they tried to slow the enemy's advance. Some managed several shots before being detected, but as soon as an Allied observer located them, the entire area was swept with mortar or flamethrower fire. One of them, Corporal Reinhard Kocher, was hiding in the bell tower of a destroyed church. He carried a rifle with an optical sight. In the first 2 hours, he made at least 12 shots. Later, a group of British soldiers located his position and used a grenade launcher to neutralize it. Kocher died inside the bell tower, buried under the rubble. At sea, the ships kept firing. The German positions on the cliffs could no longer hold. The explosions shattered the concrete structures. Many soldiers died without leaving their bunkers. Others were buried by the collapses. There was no evacuation. No one helped them. By the afternoon, several points of the defense had already been taken. The Allied forces had moved beyond the sand and were entering the nearby towns. There, the fighting continued house by house. The Germans entrenched themselves in rooms and basements, but the enemy had more men, more weapons, more vehicles. On a street in Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, a group of German soldiers was surrounded inside a house. They refused to surrender. The Allies threw incendiary bombs. The screams of those inside could be heard for minutes. Then everything fell silent. By nightfall, the German forces no longer controlled the coastline. The lines were broken. Communications did not exist. Many commanders were dead or missing. The troops were left alone, trapped between the enemy and the sea. What began as an endless wait ended in absolute chaos. Defences built over years were overrun in a matter of hours. Those who had sworn to hold out until the end were now trying to survive in a land that no longer belonged to them. Sunken commands, decisions that never came. In the early hours of the 6th of June, Rundstedt's headquarters in Saint-Germain-en-Laye was still not receiving clear information. The lines were collapsed. Only isolated reports were coming in. The radio transmitted chaos. The messages were short, confusing, and repetitive. No one knew how many beaches were under attack or whether the offensive was full-scale or a diversion. Rundstedt, Supreme Commander of the West, did not have direct control over all units. Many troops answered to other commands. Some were under the SS, others under Rommel's command. Some didn't even respond to anyone at that moment. Each division acted on its own, with whatever it had. There were commanders who did not receive a single order all day. The main problem was the control of the armoured units. The reserve tanks were distributed among Rommel, Geyer von Schweppenberg, and Hitler himself, but no one had autonomy to move them. The order to release the tanks had to come directly from the Führer's headquarters, and at that moment, Hitler was asleep. During the first 5 hours of the attack, high command officers tried to contact Berlin. They asked whether they could move their units. No one responded. They did not dare act on their own. They feared reprisals if they made a mistake. Thus, hundreds of tanks remained still while the enemy advanced. When Hitler woke up at noon, it was already too late. The beaches were under Allied control. The reports were delayed. There was mention of paratroopers, ships, bombings. The Führer, surprised, demanded details. The generals explained that the attack was real. But he still believed it was a false maneuver. That is why he did not release all the tanks. He only authorized the partial movement of some units. He said they had to wait for the real attack, which would probably be in Calais. He thought the landings in Normandy were a decoy. That idea delayed the German reaction even more. Meanwhile, at Rommel's headquarters, the situation was different. The Marshal had left the day before to visit his wife. He didn't return until the afternoon of the 6th. Upon arrival, he found chaos. The troops were overwhelmed. The beaches already belonged to the enemy. The access routes were blocked. The roads were impassable due to bombings. Reinforcements could not be sent. Rommel tried to reorganize the defense. He proposed an immediate counterattack with the armored divisions, but he had no authority to move them. He requested permission from Berlin. There was no response. Time passed. Some generals, like Marx, in command of the 84th Infantry Division, decided to act on their own. They launched limited attacks toward the beaches, but without air support or enough tanks, they were easily repelled. The casualties were extremely high. Marx was wounded by a bomb weeks later. He died in transit. General Geyer von Schweppenberg also tried to advance with his group of tanks, but he was hit by an Allied airstrike at a crossroads. His staff was destroyed. He was wounded. His unit, without command, was rendered ineffective. The attempts to reorganize the German forces were slow and uncoordinated. The roads were covered with debris. The trains had been destroyed by air raids. The fuel depots were burning. There was no way to move large units without being attacked from the air. On the coast, the German battalions resisted in isolation. Many did not know whether they were surrounded. The radios didn't work. The cables were cut. Some platoons believed they still controlled their sectors when they had already been completely overrun. The messages reaching Berlin were contradictory. Some spoke of successful resistance. Others begged desperately for help. Hitler was still waiting for the main invasion at Calais. He did not believe Normandy was the definitive location. That paralyzed any centralized reaction. Rommel, frustrated, wrote to his wife, "The bombings do not cease. The orders arrive late. Everything I proposed was disregarded. Even so, we must hold out. He moved constantly between fronts. He gathered commanders, reviewed maps, made local decisions, but without the freedom to move large units, every effort was minimal. The German Air Force had vanished from the sky. The remaining pilots were stationed at distant fields. They had no fuel. There were no spare parts. Only a few fighters operated in isolation, and they were outnumbered and outmatched by the Allies. The Luftwaffe no longer had any weight on the battlefield. The German Navy did not show up either. Most of its ships were in the Baltic or had been sunk. Only a few submarines operated in the Channel. But the Allies controlled the sea. Their vessels unleashed constant fire on the German positions. Every attempt to cross or approach was destroyed. On land, the German soldiers resisted as best they could. They used houses, ruins, ditches. Some disguised themselves as civilians. Others got lost in the countryside. There were platoons that no longer knew whom they answered to. Divisions lost contact with their regiments. Regiments lost contact with their companies. In Paris, General Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, spoke with desperation. He said they were fighting without information, that the enemy was using every form of modern warfare while they were paralyzed by bureaucracy, that each decision took hours, and that the course could no longer be changed. Hitler held his positions. He ordered that every point be defended, that no ground be surrendered, that any retreat was treason. Rommel requested an adjustment of the front to fall back to more sustainable lines. But he was ignored. Orders were given to resist to the last man. In the following weeks, the German divisions in Normandy were disintegrating. The casualties were impossible to replace. The enemy advanced with thousands of new men every day. They brought modern equipment, food, weapons, vehicles. The Germans retreated without support. The front split into multiple hotspots. Each town was a new battle. The cities were taken house by house. Every resistance was wiped out by tanks, planes, flamethrowers. There were no reinforcements. There was no way out. The German command system, rigid, centralized, and slow, had collapsed. No one made decisions on time. The generals could not act. The soldiers were alone. Each unit was trapped in its own hell. The Falaise funnel, trapped with no way out. After weeks of fighting, constant bombings, and continuous retreat, the remaining German forces in Normandy found themselves encircled. The enemy had achieved what Rommel had feared from the first day, cutting off the escape routes and closing the trap. The critical point was Falaise. The corridor between that city and Argentan became the last route to escape the encirclement. Thousands of German soldiers, along with vehicles, weapons, and horses, tried to cross it at full speed. But the Allies had already detected it. From the air, enemy planes patrolled without rest. Every movement on the ground was attacked with direct fire. The German columns became trapped among the trees, on the roads, in the midst of dust and corpses. There was no way to move quickly. Everything was blocked. German units mixed without order, infantry troops, damaged tanks, mobile kitchens, trucks loaded with wounded artillery pieces, even civilian carts, everything in an endless line trying to flee through the only open route. But the corridor grew narrower and narrower. Witnesses described that one could not walk without stepping on bodies. There were dismembered horses, burning trucks, dead soldiers sitting with their eyes still open. The smell was unbearable. The earth shook with every bomb. The sky was never clear. Sergeant Erwin Müller, a survivor of the encirclement, recounted that his platoon took more than 6 hours to advance 2 kilometers. Every so often, someone was hit by shrapnel. They didn't know where it came from. They just saw people fall, sometimes without making a sound. They kept walking. The orders were simple. Get out of there, no matter how. Some were on foot, others on stolen bicycles, many without boots. Some carried the wounded on doors, dragging them through the mud. There were officers walking with a lost look, saying nothing. Others shouted orders that no one heard. Every time a plane appeared, everyone threw themselves to the ground. Many never got back up. The trees were on fire. The explosions opened up trenches. The trucks were blown to pieces. Wheels spun on their own amid the smoke. The corridor became a field of fire. The Allies launched fire from all directions. The Canadians advanced from the north, the Americans from the south, the British from the west, closer and closer. The trap was closing. Some groups managed to break through enemy lines at night. They navigated by the stars, marched without lights, sometimes in silence, but most were captured or eliminated. Only a few made it out. The rest remained trapped inside. Among those trapped, there was no distinction. There were panzer divisions, regular soldiers, officers, medics, cooks, messengers, all mixed together. No one knew whom to obey. Some burned documents, others buried insignias. Many surrendered with their hands in the air. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber recounted that for 3 days they ate nothing. They drank water from puddles, slept among the dead. Their boots stuck to mud mixed with blood. Their clothes smelled of smoke. Their weapons ran out of ammunition. Only knives, shovels, fists remained. The Allied artillery didn't stop. They bombarded in shifts. When the shells fell silent, the fighters came. Then the mortars, then the shells again. The sound never ceased. No one could speak without shouting. Ears bled. Some lost track of time. The roads filled with abandoned vehicles. Trucks carrying ammunition exploded like fireworks. Flames reached the trees. Everything burned. Some covered themselves with wet blankets. Others buried themselves in ditches. No one was safe. In the center of the corridor, a column of tanks tried to advance. Only one made it through. The rest were stranded, trapped among bodies and wreckage. The soldiers took shelter under the armored vehicles, but they were hit anyway. The air fire came through the slits. There was no escape. General Eberbach, head of the Panzer Group, was captured while trying to cross. He was in a light vehicle, without insignias. The Allies intercepted him on a secondary road. He did not resist. He knew everything was lost. In the final hours, some German groups tried to break through by force. They attacked with whatever they had. Some carried grenade launchers, others fired from bicycles. They advanced amid explosions. Very few succeeded. A platoon that managed to get out through a nearby forest took 5 days to reach a safe point. Out of 27 men, only 7 survived. One of them wrote that the only thing he remembered was the sound of planes and the smell of burning flesh. The field between Falaise and Argentan was left covered with remains. For weeks, the inhabitants of the area saw columns of smoke, tank wreckage, human remains, dead horses. The ground was blackened. The air still smelled of death. The Allies did not collect the bodies immediately. The field was left as it was. Some soldiers took photos next to the remains. Others refused to look. The corridor was named by the French as the Road of Death. Official figures indicated that between 50,000 and 60,000 German soldiers were encircled. More than 10,000 died in the trap. Thousands more were captured. Only a fraction managed to escape. The German army in Normandy was shattered. After Falaise, the Western Front could no longer stop the Allied advance. German defense became a series of improvised lines. Order vanished. Command became symbolic. Morale collapsed. What had been an organized force ended up as a group of survivors. The Falaise encirclement sealed the fate of the German army in France. It was not a battle. It was a slow massacre, under open sky, without protection, without command, without hope. Commandless captives, the days following the surrender. After the collapse in Normandy, thousands of German soldiers fell into Allied hands. Many surrendered with their hands raised. Others were captured among the rubble. Some wandered aimlessly, looking for a place to surrender. The divisions had ceased to exist as structures. Only isolated groups remained. Along rural roads, columns of prisoners advanced on foot. They wore only what they had on. Some barefoot, others with improvised bandages. Their faces covered in dust. Many were wounded, others in shock. They marched in silence, watched over by armed guards. They didn't know where they were going. The Allies improvised detention camps. Some were fences set up in open fields. Others, yards enclosed with wire. There were no facilities, nor any shade. The soldiers slept on the ground, surrounded by barbed wire. They were fed minimal rations. Some went days without drinking water. An Allied officer wrote that the German prisoners looked like ghosts. Thin, filthy, exhausted. Some with vacant stares. Others asked for news of their families. Many cried upon seeing their fallen comrades along the way. No one spoke of victory. In a camp near Bayeux, more than 5,000 soldiers were gathered. There were no bathrooms or medical aid, only a few buckets for waste. Disease spread quickly. The summer heat made everything worse. Cries of pain were heard day and night. Some prisoners tried to organize. They formed lines, established shifts. Others gave up completely. There were men who didn't move for hours. A French soldier helping at the site said most didn't respond when spoken to, as if their thoughts had been shut off. German officers were also captured. Many hid their ranks to avoid reprisals. They stripped off insignias, burned documents. Some were recognized by their own soldiers. Others tried to blend in among the enlisted prisoners. In one of the camps, a general was identified by his posture and way of speaking. British soldiers separated him and interrogated him. He refused to answer. He only asked for water and a chair. He spent 3 days in silence. Then he was transferred. Conditions varied depending on the camp. Some were better organized, others were improvised. The captured soldiers were interrogated by Allied officers. They were asked about positions, units, plans. Many didn't know what to say. They just repeated that everything was over. In Normandy, the camps filled quickly. When there was no space, the prisoners were sent into the interior of France. Some were transported by truck, others walked for days. There were marches of 20, 30, even 40 kilometers under the sun. Several died from exhaustion. A 19-year-old, recruited months earlier, recounted that he walked for 3 days without food. He fed on roots. Upon arrival at the camp, he was separated from his group. He never saw anyone he knew again. He spent a month locked in a wire-enclosed camp, sleeping on stone. Afterwards, he was sent by train to England. Some Allied officers treated the prisoners with respect. Others did not. There were abuses, insults, beatings. Several German soldiers were assaulted by French civilians as they passed through towns destroyed by bombings. No one intervened. The French had lost homes, families, crops. They saw the prisoners as the cause of it all. Some spat at them, others threw stones. There were villages that forced the German soldiers to clean rubble, bury bodies, or collect remains. In a northern town, a group of soldiers was forced to work on the reconstruction of a church. They slept in a stable, ate once a day. The local commandless captives, the days following the surrender. After the collapse in Normandy, thousands of German soldiers fell into Allied hands. Many surrendered with their hands raised. Others were captured among the rubble. Some wandered aimlessly, looking for a place to surrender. The divisions had ceased to exist as structures. Only isolated groups remained. Along rural roads, columns of prisoners advanced on foot. They wore only what they had on. Some barefoot, others with improvised bandages. Their faces covered in dust. Many were wounded, others in shock. They marched in silence, watched over by armed guards. They didn't know where they were going. The Allies improvised detention camps. Some were fences set up in open fields, others yards enclosed with wire. There were no facilities, nor any shade. The soldiers slept on the ground, surrounded by barbed wire. They were fed minimal rations. Some went days without drinking water. An Allied officer wrote that the German prisoners looked like ghosts, thin, filthy, exhausted. Some with vacant stares, others asked for news of their families. Many cried upon seeing their fallen comrades along the way. No one spoke of victory. In a camp near Bayeux, more than 5,000 soldiers were gathered. There were no bathrooms or medical aid, only a few buckets for waste. Disease spread quickly. The summer heat made everything worse. Cries of pain were heard day and night. Some prisoners tried to organize. They formed lines, established shifts. Others gave up completely. There were men who didn't move for hours. A French soldier helping at the site said most didn't respond when spoken to, as if their thoughts had been shut off. German officers were also captured. Many hid their ranks to avoid reprisals. They stripped off insignias, burned documents. Some were recognized by their own soldiers. Others tried to blend in among the enlisted prisoners. In one of the camps, a general was identified by his posture and way of speaking. British soldiers separated him and interrogated him. He refused to answer. He only asked for water and a chair. He spent 3 days in silence. Then he was transferred. Conditions varied depending on the camp. Some were better organized, others were improvised. The captured soldiers were interrogated by Allied officers. They were asked about positions, units, plans. Many didn't know what to say. They just repeated that everything was over. In Normandy, the camps filled quickly. When there was no space, the bunker and the echo, decisions from confinement. While the front was collapsing in Normandy, Hitler remained in his Rastenburg headquarters, surrounded by maps, incomplete reports, and fearful generals. He received news in fragments. The messages arrived late. What happened on the field took hours to reach his desk. During the first days of the invasion, he refused to accept that Normandy was the main site of the attack. He remained convinced that the real landing would be at Calais. He ordered the reserves not to be moved. He commanded them to wait. The armoured divisions remained motionless. When the reports arrived that the Allies had broken through the defences and were advancing inland, Hitler reacted with fury. He accused his commanders of acting without willpower. He shouted that they had disobeyed, that they hadn't trusted his decisions. He said they had betrayed him. He gathered his inner circle in long nightly sessions. He reviewed every part of the front, pointed to routes with his finger, asked about divisions that no longer existed, gave orders that could no longer be carried out, ordered reinforcements to positions that had fallen days earlier. The generals remained silent. None dared contradict him. Some tried to soften the reports, others avoided speaking. Only one or two, like Jodl or Keitel, repeated his words. No one told him what was truly happening. All feared his reaction. Rommel, one of the few with autonomy, tried to explain the real situation to him. In a meeting, he told him that without air control and without the freedom to move troops, the front was lost, that continuing to resist in Normandy was impossible, that they had to retreat. Hitler listened in silence. He did not respond immediately. Days later, Rommel was wounded in an air attack. His car was hit. He suffered fractures. He was removed from command. He never returned to the front. From that point on, the relationship between Hitler and his generals became more strained. He distrusted everyone. He changed commanders every week. He gave orders directly to divisions without going through the chain of command. He interfered in the smallest decisions. Everything had to go through him. In the bunker, the nights were long. He locked himself in with maps and papers. He read intelligence reports over and over again. He searched for signs of betrayal. He ordered arrests. He repeated that the army had to obey without question. That willpower alone was enough to win. When the Allies liberated Paris, Hitler did not react publicly. He simply ordered the city to be destroyed if it was taken. General von Choltitz, in charge of the garrison, refused to comply. He surrendered the city. He was later arrested. Hitler called him a coward. The High Command no longer functioned as before. Reports were hidden. Casualty numbers were manipulated. Defeats were described as tactical withdrawals. Destroyed units were omitted. A fictional reality was created. At night, Hitler walked alone through the headquarters hallways. He talked to his dog, repeated phrases about loyalty and destiny, wrote down ideas on napkins, sent letters to dead generals. Isolated, he lost contact with the field. He no longer trusted anyone. The High Command tried to regain control. Some generals, like Guderian and Model, proposed reorganizing the front. They called for withdrawals, reallocation of resources. But Hitler opposed. He ordered resistance. Every meter of ground had to be defended as if it were Berlin. He ordered the construction of defensive lines behind lines that were already lost. Resources were spent on bunkers that were never used. Meanwhile, there were shortages of ammunition, winter clothing, and fuel. The soldiers received contradictory orders. No one knew what to do. Allied reports spoke of an enemy without clear command, of troops fighting by inertia, of generals requesting orders from Berlin and receiving silence. The chaos in German command became evident. In July, a group of German officers tried to kill Hitler. The attempt failed, but it marked a turning point. From then on, Hitler distrusted even his aides. He changed residence, increased security, secluded himself even more. The atmosphere in the bunker grew more tense. No one raised their voice. The meetings were monologues. Hitler spoke for hours. The others nodded. Important decisions were made without debate. The army was bound to his will. In Normandy, meanwhile, the last German units were being wiped out. The divisions that had survived the Falaise encirclement were reduced. Reserves no longer existed. Reinforcements never arrived. More ground was lost each day. But in the bunker, the map still showed lines. Hitler insisted on holding positions. He did not accept withdrawals. He ordered counterattacks with phantom units. He believed a change of fortune was possible, that history would turn back in his favor. The generals knew everything was lost, but no one said it. In the hallways, some whispered. Others waited for the moment to flee. Some were already planning their surrender to the Allies. Only a few still believed. The failure in Normandy was not only military, it was the collapse of German command. Decisions were no longer based on facts. They were guided by fantasies, by maps, by speeches. Reality no longer mattered. The fall of France marked the beginning of the end. Hitler, confined, isolated and distrustful, took absolute control. Each day farther from the front, each day closer to collapse. Endless retreat, final steps of the German army in France. After the Falaise encirclement, the German front in France collapsed. The divisions that managed to escape were shattered. They had no vehicles. The soldiers moved along secondary routes, avoiding highways, crossing fields. Most advanced on foot, without ammunition, without radios, without a clear destination. In the inland villages, French civilians no longer felt fear. Some came out to watch the retreating columns. Others opened looted houses. Resistance groups operated openly. They took bridges, eliminated patrols. The German occupation network was vanishing. The roads were filled with debris, abandoned trucks, cannons without wheels, piles of discarded uniforms, burned documents. Each platoon did what it could. There were no clear orders. All that remained was to retreat. The survivors spoke little. They walked in small groups, some bandaged, others barefoot, many without insignias. They avoided towns, slept in forests, ate roots, dry bread, whatever they could find. Military discipline no longer existed. Corporal Karl Hense recalled that they crossed the Seine on an improvised bridge. On the other side, no one was waiting for them. No trucks, no medics, no commanders, only more tired soldiers. Everyone asked the same question, and now what do we do? The defensive lines Berlin had promised were never built. The rear positions were empty. Reserves no longer existed. The Air Force didn't fly. The artillery didn't fire. Only ruins remained. In Paris, the German flag fell without a shot. The last units withdrew without fighting. Some left messages on the walls. "We will return." Others destroyed their weapons. The general in charge did not destroy the city. He ignored the order. He surrendered the capital without resistance. The High Command did not appear. Hitler did not speak about France, only about the Eastern Front. He said that was where the real battle was. Meanwhile, the soldiers in the west crossed Belgium, Luxembourg, until reaching Germany. In Aachen, the streets were filled with scattered units, groups of 5, 6 men without command. The hospitals no longer accepted more wounded. The train stations were overwhelmed. There was no transport, only smoke, ruins, and silent soldiers. A lieutenant recounted that he spent 3 weeks without knowing to whom he should report. He wandered between villages, asking for his regiment. He never found it. In the end, he was assigned to a replacement unit, but it no longer mattered. Everything was falling apart. Morale was destroyed. No one spoke of victory, only of surviving. Some tried to reach home. Others hid on farms. Some surrendered to the Allies. They said they preferred to be prisoners than to die pointlessly. At the stations, military trains no longer had direction. Wagons full of weapons with no destination. Empty containers, broken crates, unburied bodies in the ditches. The chaos was total. In southern France, troops were also retreating. Operation Dragoon, launched in August, pushed the German army toward the Alps. The units withdrew without fighting. The terrain was difficult. The weather worsened. No one had updated maps. The number of prisoners increased every day. The columns of German soldiers in Allied hands stretched for kilometers along the roads. Officers were mixed with recruits, medics, cooks, mechanics, all captured, all disarmed. Letters from the front stopped arriving. German families received generic notifications. Missing, prisoner, wounded. Many never knew the final fate of their sons. Censorship prevented the truth from being told. The generals who had survived the disaster were summoned to Berlin. Some were dismissed. Others disappeared. The Central Command only listened to what it wanted to hear. There was talk of controlled withdrawals. No one said defeat. On the German border, new defensive lines were improvised. Trenches were dug, machine gun nests were built, traps were set, but there were not enough soldiers, nor ammunition, nor hope. Those coming from the front knew they would not hold. They had seen it. They had lived it. The Allies had tanks, food, planes, radios, fuel. They had memories, wounds, fear, nothing more. Colonel Siegfried Karl, who led a panzer unit in Normandy, wrote in his diary, "This is no longer a war, it is a fall, a slow, painful descent with no clear end." He was captured a month later. Some soldiers tried to desert. They took off their uniforms, blended in among civilians. Others took refuge in convents, in remote villages. Some managed to hide for months. Others were denounced by neighbors. Fear of punishment from their own army was greater than fear of the enemy. There were platoons tasked with hunting deserters. Quick executions were ordered. The bodies were left by the roadside with signs that read, "Traitor." Winter arrived with what remained of the army still unreorganized. Broken boots, thin coats, minimal rations. The cold killed more than bullets. In the forests of western Germany, survivors of Normandy dug holes to sleep in. Every night, footsteps were heard, stray gunshots, distant screams. No one knew if they were enemies or their own. No one trusted anyone. The army had become a shadow, a shattered reflection of what it once was. From Rastenburg, Hitler continued sending telegrams. He demanded resistance, swore that fortune would turn, that the enemy would tire, that Germany could still win. But for those coming from the west, those words meant nothing anymore. The Western Front, built with years of resources, propaganda and death, had shattered in weeks. The beaches that were supposed to be the enemy's grave had become the beginning of the end, and those who returned did so with sunken eyes and the war etched into their skin. After the landing in Normandy, the German army lost the initiative. The units were cut off, with no connection between them. Communications were disrupted from the very beginning, and the orders took so long to arrive that they were no longer useful. The command continued to expect an attack at Calais, while the real blow advanced from the west. The reserves remained motionless until it was already too late. The armoured divisions were unable to intervene quickly, and by the time they entered combat, the enemy had already taken control of the key ground. The fixed defences were overrun one by one. The intermediate positions were abandoned without relief. The escape routes were blocked by the Allied advance. The German soldiers fought with what they had, isolated without air cover or reinforcements. Several were trapped in surrounded towns. Others were pursued during the retreat. Those who survived spoke of exhaustion, disorder, unrelenting fire, and long silences between bursts. No one mentioned victories, only resistance, until there was no way to hold on. Normandy was the exact moment when the German Western Front ceased to exist as a real structure. Everything unravelled from within.